At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the frozen silence of the Ardennes forest shattered into chaos. Nearly 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front, stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The ground trembled beneath the snow. Trees splintered and crashed. American soldiers in foxholes pressed themselves into the frozen earth as shells screamed overhead, their explosions lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like hellish lightning. In villages scattered throughout the forested hills, sleeping GIs were jolted awake by the thunderous barrage. Windows blew inward, walls collapsed, men scrambled for their weapons, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, their hands shaking from more than just the -15-degree temperatures. This was Hitler's last desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the offensive that would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The German attack force was massive, beyond anything the Americans had faced since the Normandy landing 6 months earlier. 3 armies totaling over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surged forward through the fog and snow. They advanced through terrain that Allied commanders had dismissed as impossible for large-scale offensive operations. The thick forests, deep valleys, and winding roads seemed to favor the defender, but German planners knew this ground well. They had used it before, in May of 1940, when their panzers had smashed through French defenses in the same forests and changed the course of the war. The element of surprise was complete. American intelligence had failed utterly to detect the German buildup. Radio silence had been maintained for weeks. Troop movements occurred only at night under heavy cloud cover. Overcast skies had grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Even intercepted communications gave no warning because the Germans had used landlines instead of radio. When the attack came, it struck like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. What those terrified American soldiers did not know, what the attacking German divisions could not possibly imagine, was that a secret weapon was about to be unleashed against them. A device so closely guarded that its security classification rivaled the atomic bomb itself. A weapon that would turn ordinary artillery shells into instruments of terror that seemed to defy the laws of physics. German soldiers would soon face death raining down from above, explosions that burst directly over their heads, no matter how deep they dug, no matter how thick the forest canopy, no matter where they tried to hide. They called it the funny fuse, the proximity fuse, and it was about to change the Battle of the Bulge forever. The VT proximity fuse was in essence a complete miniature radar system packed into a space no larger than a pint milk bottle. It fit into the nose cone of a standard artillery shell, yet contained approximately 130 electronic components, including 5 vacuum tubes, each weighing about 3 grams. This tiny device could detect when a shell was approaching a target and detonate it at precisely the optimal moment without any human involvement, without any timing mechanism that had to be set before firing. The name VT officially stood for variable time, a deliberately misleading name chosen by Captain S.R. Shoemaker of the Bureau of Ordnance to hide the true nature of the technology. The name suggested merely a variable delay timer while revealing nothing about the revolutionary radio technology inside. This deception was maintained throughout the war. Even many of the soldiers who fired VT-fused shells had no idea how they actually worked. They only knew that these special shells seemed to burst at exactly the right moment every time, regardless of conditions. The way it worked relied on the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a police siren seem to change pitch as it passes. A single vacuum tube generated a continuous radio frequency signal at approximately 180 to 220 megahertz. The shell body itself functioned as the antenna, transmitting and receiving at the same time as the projectile hurtled through the air at speeds exceeding 2,000 feet per second. As the shell approached a target, whether an aircraft, the ground, or forest canopy, the reflected signal interfered with the transmitted signal.
When this interference reached a level indicating the target was within lethal blast range, the fuse triggered the explosion at precisely the optimal moment. The battery system was equally clever and represented a breakthrough in its own right. A reserve battery the size of a fountain pen contained stacked carbon and zinc plates kept completely dry during storage. A sealed glass capsule held the liquid needed to make the battery work. Upon firing, the enormous force of the launch, equivalent to 20,000 times the force of gravity, shattered the capsule. Then the spinning motion of the shell spread the liquid into the plates, generating sufficient power within milliseconds to operate the fuse electronics. This design gave the fuse an essentially indefinite shelf life, since the battery remained inactive until the moment of firing. The factory that produced these tiny glass capsules had previously manufactured Christmas tree light bulbs, which became unavailable for American consumers for the entire duration of the war. Multiple safety mechanisms prevented the shell from going off too early. A battery activation delay, a clockwork arming device triggered by centrifugal force, and a mercury safety switch that only cleared the firing circuit after the shell was spinning properly, all had to work correctly in sequence. The standard for safety was no more than 1 accidental detonation per million rounds fired. This reliability was essential since artillery crews had to trust completely that the shells would not explode in the barrel or immediately after leaving the muzzle. Against ground targets, the fuse detonated shells at an ideal height of 20 to 50 feet above the surface, roughly 30 feet for 105 and 155 millimeter howitzers, and 70 feet or more for larger guns. The result was devastating. A conventional artillery shell explodes on impact, driving most of its energy and fragments uselessly into the ground. The crater it creates is impressive, but the area where it can actually kill is surprisingly small. Soldiers learned early in the war that pressing flat against the bottom of a foxhole provided excellent protection from conventional shells bursting nearby. The fragments flew outward and upward, passing over men lying in their holes. But a proximity-fused shell detonating 20 to 50 feet above the surface showered fragments downward over a massive area. The zone where the shell could kill expanded from roughly 60 square feet with a ground burst to approximately 3,000 square feet with an air burst. That was a 50-fold improvement in killing power. Overall, lethality increased an estimated 5 to 10 times over conventional shells. A single proximity-fused shell could now accomplish what had previously required an entire battery firing multiple rounds.
The engineering challenges that had to be overcome were enormous, and many experts had believed them impossible to solve. Firing a 5-inch naval gun subjected the fuse to 20,000 times the force of gravity, accelerating the shell to 2,800 feet per second almost instantly. The rifling of the gun barrel spun the projectile at over 400 rotations per second, creating additional forces that tried to tear the fuse apart. Each 3-gram vacuum tube experienced a crushing force equivalent to 140 pounds. As one researcher described it, imagine a grown woman standing with all her weight on a single stiletto heel, that heel pressing down on a tiny glass tube. That was the force each component had to survive, while still functioning as a precision electronic instrument capable of detecting targets and triggering detonation with split-second timing. The development of this weapon represented one of the greatest scientific achievements in American history. A story of brilliant minds racing against time while the fate of nations hung in the balance. It began with the British. In 1940, researchers at the Air Defense Experimental Establishment near Portsmouth drafted a secret document describing a fuse that could use reflected radio frequency energy to detonate at closest approach to a target. The idea was elegant, but the practical challenges seemed impossible to overcome. Britain, in 1940, faced imminent invasion. Every resource was devoted to immediate survival. There was no capacity to develop weapons that might not be ready for years.
The British team conducted early tests and achieved some success with prototype fuses, but the critical challenge of making electronics survive artillery firing forces remained unsolved. The forces involved were far greater than anything in bomb or rocket applications. British industry, already stretched to the breaking point producing Spitfires, Hurricanes, tanks, and ships, could not devote the resources needed to solve this problem. When the Tizard mission arrived in the United States in September 1940, it carried Britain's most precious military secrets in a single black metal box. The mission was led by Sir Henry Tizard, the distinguished scientific advisor who had championed radar development in Britain. Its purpose was to share advanced British technology with the still neutral Americans in hopes of obtaining industrial help and scientific partnership. Winston Churchill had approved the mission despite the risk, calculating that American industrial might was essential to British survival. Among the treasures in that box was the cavity magnetron, the device that would revolutionize radar and help win the Battle of the Atlantic, but also included were the plans and concepts for the proximity fuse, a weapon that British scientists believed in but could not build themselves. On September 19, 1940, physicist John Cockcroft, who would later win the Nobel Prize for splitting the atom, explained the proximity fuse design to Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution of Washington. That meeting would prove decisive. Tuve had already been appointed to lead a section of the National Defense Research Committee charged with developing new weapons for national defense. Now he had found his mission. He immediately understood both the potential and the challenges of the proximity fuse concept, and within days had redirected his entire team toward making it a reality. Tuve was a driven physicist who had pioneered the use of pulsed radio waves to measure the height of the ionosphere, work that served as a precursor to radar. He had also conducted important nuclear physics research. Born in Canton, South Dakota in 1901, he held a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University and had maintained a close friendship with Ernest Lawrence, the inventor of the cyclotron, since their boyhood days in South Dakota. Working with colleagues from the Carnegie Institution, Tuve's team investigated multiple approaches. They examined fuses that would detect the shadow of a target against the bright sky. They tested fuses that would respond to the sound of aircraft engines. They explored various radio-based designs using different frequencies and circuit arrangements. After months of careful experimentation, they settled on radio as the most promising path. A young physicist named James Van Allen devoted himself to the most challenging problem of all, developing vacuum tubes tough enough to survive being fired from a cannon. Van Allen, born in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 1914, would later discover the radiation belts that bear his name and become one of the most celebrated space scientists in American history. But in 1941, he spent nearly a year working with a Massachusetts hearing aid company to solve a seemingly impossible engineering problem. Starting from miniature hearing aid tubes, Van Allen tested and changed designs until he created components that could withstand forces that would crush ordinary electronics. The tubes were embedded in special shock-absorbing materials, coated in wax, and packed in oil to spread the stress evenly and prevent the glass from breaking. Each tiny tube had to survive forces equivalent to 140 pounds pressing on an area smaller than a fingernail. The pace of development was extraordinary. By May 1941, less than a year after the Tizard mission, fuse-equipped bombs had been successfully tested over water at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. By September 1941, a complete shell fuse worked properly in test firing from a standard naval gun. On January 29, 1942, the first batch of production-type fuses achieved a 52% success rate when fired from a standard anti-aircraft gun. Though below Tuve's ambitious 80% goal, Commander William Deke Parsons of the Bureau of Ordnance recommended that mass production could begin. Every day of delay meant more American ships sunk and more American sailors killed by Japanese aircraft. The Pearl Harbor attack had occurred just 7 weeks earlier, and the Navy desperately needed any advantage it could get against the skilled Japanese aviators who seemed to dominate the Pacific skies. In March 1942, a contract established the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. The laboratory was initially housed in a former automobile dealership on Georgia Avenue, an unlikely birthplace for one of the war's most important weapons. Tuve conceived the name himself, deliberately choosing words that revealed nothing about the laboratory's true purpose. His leadership style became legendary among his staff. Signs posted throughout the facility read, "I do not want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another sign proclaimed, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." A third declared, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit." These were not empty slogans, but guiding principles that shaped every decision.
The proof that the weapon truly worked came on August 12, 1942, in Chesapeake Bay off the Virginia coast. The cruiser USS Cleveland tested proximity-fused ammunition against radio-controlled drone aircraft, the standard test targets used by the Navy to evaluate anti-aircraft systems. The results stunned every naval officer present. 3 drones were destroyed with just 4 bursts. Navy observers had never seen drones totally destroyed before. The proximity-fused shells did not merely damage the targets or cause them to crash, they blew them apart in midair. The scheduled 2-day test was canceled after just 1 day. There was no need to continue. Mass production was ordered immediately. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using proximity-fused 5-inch shells. The aircraft was destroyed by shells that detonated at precisely the right instant, without the gunners having to estimate range or set complex timing mechanisms. Over the following months, the Fuze proved its worth again and again in the desperate battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. By the end of 1943, only 25% of naval anti-aircraft shells fired carried proximity fuses, yet these shells accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The mathematics were undeniable. A VT fuse shell was roughly 4 times more effective than a conventional timed fuse shell. Meanwhile, in the winter of 1944, Adolf Hitler was planning his final gamble in an underground bunker far from the front lines. He had watched as Allied forces pushed across France after D-Day, liberating Paris in August and reaching the German border by September. The Wehrmacht was bleeding to death on 2 fronts, with Soviet armies grinding westward through Poland and Anglo-American forces pressing from the west toward the Rhine. Germany's strategic position seemed hopeless to most rational observers. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. He believed that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was unnatural and fragile, held together only by momentary common interest. If he could strike a crippling blow against the Americans and British, they might seek a separate peace, leaving Germany free to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet threat. It was a fantasy, but Hitler had built his career on defying conventional wisdom and achieving what others declared impossible. In the deepest secrecy, he ordered a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route German panzers had taken to such spectacular success in May of 1940. That earlier campaign had knocked France out of the war in 6 weeks and made Hitler master of Western Europe. He convinced himself that one more great victory could change everything. If he could split the Western Allies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp, he could cut off supplies to the British and American armies. They would be forced to negotiate. He could then turn all his remaining strength against the Soviets. The plan was bold to the point of delusion. 3 German armies would smash through weak American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp within 2 weeks. Hitler dictated every detail of the plan himself, attaching a handwritten note reading, "Not to be altered." His generals had serious doubts. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, the commander of German forces in the West, privately called the plan damned foolish. General Hasso von Montefeld pleaded for changes that might make success possible, but none dared express open opposition. Those who disagreed with Hitler had a way of disappearing. The attack force was the largest Germany could still put together. The 6th SS Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich would drive toward the northern shoulder, aiming for Liège and then Antwerp. This force included the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstand Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, both fanatical Nazi formations filled with men who believed completely in Hitler and National Socialism.
Hasso von Montefel's 5th Panzer Army would strike through the center toward the critical road junctions of St. Vith and Bastogne. Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would protect the southern flank of the advance against any American counterattack. Facing them stood roughly 83,000 Americans, a mix of fresh divisions that had never seen combat and battle-worn veterans sent to what they called the Ghost Front to recover. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in the Ardennes sector only 5 days before the attack. Many of its soldiers had never fired their weapons at an enemy. The 28th Infantry Division was still recovering from catastrophic losses in the Hopkins forest, where it had suffered over 6,000 casualties in some of the most brutal fighting of the European campaign. Allied intelligence had completely failed to detect the German buildup. Radio silence had been maintained for weeks throughout the German assembly areas. Troop movements occurred only at night under heavy cloud cover that grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Even the decoded German messages that had provided such crucial intelligence throughout the war gave no warning because the Germans communicated using secure landlines rather than radio. The stage was set for catastrophe. But there was something the Germans did not know. Hidden in American ammunition dumps across France and Belgium was a stockpile of artillery shells equipped with the secret proximity-fuzed. For nearly 2 years, this weapon had been restricted almost exclusively to use over water. The reason was straightforward and well-founded. If a shell that failed to explode landed on solid ground, the Germans could recover it, study the technology, and develop their own version to use against Allied bombers and troops. German scientists were among the best in the world. Given a working example, they might quickly produce their own. The combined chiefs of staff had formally maintained this restriction since the Fuze entered combat in January 1943. The policy was controversial. Army commanders who knew about the Fuze wanted to use it against ground troops, but General Hap Arnold, who commanded the massive bomber fleet striking Germany daily, was particularly insistent on keeping the ban in place. He feared that proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells in German hands could devastate his formations. The 8th Air Force was already suffering terrible casualties over the Reich. Proximity fuses in German guns might make daylight bombing impossible. The Fuze had been used over land only once before, defending London against V-1 flying bombs starting in June 1944. But even then, the anti-aircraft batteries were carefully placed along the English coast so that unexploded shells would fall into the channel rather than German-occupied territory. Every precaution was taken to prevent the secret from falling into enemy hands. The original plan called for releasing the Fuze for general artillery use on Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. By that point, Allied forces would presumably be so deep into Germany that any captured fuses would come too late to Nair. But the German offensive was about to shatter that careful timetable.
December 16, 1944, began like any other day on the Ghost Front. American soldiers in their foxholes ate cold rations and huddled against the bitter cold that had descended over the Ardennes. Forward observers peered through binoculars at the fog-shrouded German lines, seeing nothing unusual. Some men wrote letters home, carefully choosing words that the censors would approve, expressing love for families they might never see again without being able to say so directly. Others played cards or caught what sleep they could in the frozen earth, their bodies wrapped in every piece of clothing they could find. No one expected anything unusual. Intelligence reports showed no significant German activity. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place to rest exhausted divisions and train new ones before throwing them back into the grinding advance toward Berlin. Then, at 5:30 in the morning, the bombardment began, and everything changed. The initial German attack was overwhelming, the worst blow the Americans had suffered since the dark days of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia nearly 2 years earlier. Units all along the front were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the attack. The 106th Infantry Division, still learning the terrain and settling into positions it had occupied for less than a week, was hit particularly hard. German assault troops moved between its scattered positions under cover of fog and snow. Communications were cut. Units lost contact with each other and with higher headquarters. Within the first 2 days, 2 of the division's regiments were completely surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. Surrounded, without supplies, their ammunition running low, their radios unable to reach anyone who could help. Approximately 7,000 men faced an impossible choice. After desperate attempts to break out failed, they were forced to surrender. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in United States Army history, second only to the fall of Patton and Corregidor in the Philippines in 1942. The 28th Infantry Division, already weakened from the brutal fighting in the Hopkins forest, fought desperate delaying actions at catastrophic cost. Its regiments were spread thin across a front that would normally require an entire corps to defend. When the German tide rolled forward, individual companies and battalions found themselves isolated, fighting alone against overwhelming odds. At Malmedy, on December 17th, Waffen-SS troops under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper committed one of the war's worst atrocities.
Piper's battle group was the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance, tasked with racing ahead of the main force to seize bridges over the Meuse. When his troops captured approximately 150 American soldiers near the crossroads, something terrible happened. The prisoners were herded into a field. Then, without warning, SS troops opened fire with machine guns. Approximately 84 unarmed American prisoners of war were murdered in cold blood. Some who survived the initial massacre by playing dead were shot one by one as SS soldiers walked among the bodies. A few managed to escape and brought word of the atrocity to American lines. News of the Malmedy massacre spread quickly through American units throughout the Ardennes. The effect on morale was complex. Some soldiers were terrified, knowing that capture might mean death, but many more were enraged. The massacre hardened American resolve and removed any inclination to show mercy to SS troops. From that point forward, many American units took few SS prisoners. The war in the Ardennes became even more brutal than it had been before. Heavily overcast skies, freezing rain, and deep snow grounded Allied air power for the first 9 days of the offensive. The weather that Hitler had counted on was cooperating perfectly. American commanders begged for air support that could not come. Without aircraft to attack German tanks and supply columns, the ground forces had to fight the panzers with what they had, primarily artillery, tank destroyers, and their own determination. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, the 5th Panzer Army had advanced 50 miles into American positions and stood within 4 miles of the Meuse River. German advance units could see the spires of Dinant in the distance. The plan seemed to be working. One more push might carry them to their objectives. At the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division under Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe found itself completely surrounded by December 20th. The town controlled 7 major roads essential for German logistics. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network of the Central Ardennes. If it fell, German tanks would have a clear path to the Meuse and beyond. McAuliffe had approximately 18,000 troops, including elements of the 10th Armored Division. They were short of everything. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to respond to German attacks. Food was running short. Medical supplies were critically low. Wounded men lay in cellars throughout the town, waiting for treatment that might never come. The cold was relentless, and fuel for heating was almost gone. When German commanders sent messengers under a white flag on December 22nd, demanding surrender, McAuliffe gave his reply with a single word that would become legend: nuts. The German officers were confused by the American slang and had to ask what it meant. They were told it was the same as telling them to go to hell. The Germans departed, and the siege of Bastogne continued. But even as the situation seemed most desperate, even as German tanks threatened to break through at multiple points along the extended front, a fateful decision was being made in American headquarters. On December 16th itself, the very first day of the German offensive, Colonel Oscar A. Axelson made an unauthorized decision that would help change the course of the battle. Axelson commanded a field artillery group, and his guns were supporting American cavalry at Monschau on the northern shoulder of the German attack. His position was directly in the path of the 6th SS Panzer Army's main effort. Wave after wave of German infantry attacked through the snow, supported by artillery and assault guns. Axelson's conventional ammunition was having an effect, but not enough to stop the assault. The Germans kept coming, climbing over their own dead to press the attack. He made a choice that could have ended his career, one that went against standing orders from the highest levels of command.
He ordered his batteries to load the secret proximity-fused shells, the ones he had been explicitly forbidden to use over land. Minutes later, rounds began detonating directly above the heads of the attacking German infantry. The effect was immediate and devastating. Men who had survived countless bombardments on the Eastern Front and in Normandy found themselves facing something entirely new. Shells did not impact the ground and explode outward. They burst in the air above them, showering fragments straight down into their foxholes, their trenches, their carefully prepared positions. There was no escape. There was no protection. The tactics that had kept them alive through years of warfare were suddenly useless. The attack collapsed. Germans who had been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves dying by the dozens, cut down by a weapon they could not understand and against which they had no defense. 3 days later, on December 19th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower formally requested clearance to use proximity fuses for field artillery across the entire European theater. The German offensive had made the need obvious. Whatever risk there might be of the Germans capturing the technology was now outweighed by the desperate military situation. If the Germans broke through to the Meuse, if Antwerp fell, the entire campaign in Western Europe might be set back by months. By December 21st, all restrictions were removed. The stockpiled proximity fuses flooded into the battle. General George S. Patton had attended a demonstration of the proximity fuse on December 16th, ironically the same day the German offensive began. He recognized its potential immediately and ordered the shells held back for a decisive moment, rather than using them up in the initial defensive fighting.
When his Third Army launched its legendary counterattack to relieve Bastogne, driving north through bitter cold and enemy resistance in one of the most famous military moves of the war, proximity-fused artillery accompanied the advance. At Echternach in Luxembourg, forward observers watched the effects of the new weapon with something approaching awe. They reported seeing bursts from the proximity fuse 30 feet over the heads of retreating Germans, and the devastating effects as enemy troops attempted to cross the Sauer River on wooden bridges and rubber boats. Men caught in the open had no chance. Patton recorded in his diary that on the night of December 25th to 26th, 702 Germans were killed by actual count from a single battalion concentration. The number was precise because American troops advanced over the ground the next morning and counted the bodies. American infantrymen quickly gave the weapon a grim nickname. They called it a Christmas present for the Germans. The devastating effectiveness of the proximity fuse in the Battle of the Bulge resulted from a deadly combination of technology and terrain that even its designers had not fully expected. The densely forested Ardennes made the weapon even more lethal in ways that turned the Germans' chosen battlefield into a killing ground from which there was no escape. The fuse's radio signal detected the tree canopy as a reflecting surface, triggering detonation among the branches overhead. These tree bursts showered fragments downward while at the same time shattering tree trunks into secondary wooden projectiles. Splinters driven downward at lethal speed punched through even log-reinforced bunkers. Soldiers who thought themselves safe beneath thick forest cover were killed by the very trees meant to protect them. A single shell could now clear an area that would previously have required dozens of shells hitting the ground. German tactical thinking had assumed that overcast skies and poor visibility would prevent the accurate observation required for effective time airburst fire. Traditional airburst ammunition required observers to carefully adjust timing, watching where shells burst and radioing corrections back to the gun crews. It was a slow process that required clear sightlines and multiple trial rounds. The Germans had no concept of a self-adjusting fuse that did this work automatically, that set its burst height perfectly with every single round, regardless of conditions. As a result, German divisions moved in the open, believing themselves safe. They were caught in killing zones with nowhere to hide. High-velocity artillery shells gave no warning. The sound of the guns reached soldiers only after the shells had already burst overhead. Foxholes, the universal refuge of the infantrymen since World War I, offered no protection against fragments raining straight down. The mathematics of the situation were inescapable. A shell bursting 20 feet in the air distributes its lethal energy over an area 50 times larger than a ground impact. There simply was no defense against a weapon that struck from directly above. The accounts of German soldiers tell the story of the psychological damage done. At Malmedy on December 21st, just 4 days after the massacre of American prisoners at that same location, 6 American artillery battalions unleashed a barrage totaling 3,000 rounds, including proximity-fused airbursts against Otto Skorzeny's 150th Panzer Brigade. Skorzeny was Hitler's favorite commando leader, famous for the daring raid that rescued Mussolini from captivity in 1943. His brigade was attempting to push through a gap in American lines when the barrage caught them in an open valley with a 15-foot railway embankment on one side offering no cover. The Germans broke completely. Some charged directly into the artillery fire, screaming Kamerad, the German word for surrender. They preferred near-certain death to enduring another moment under the airbursts. Others threw down their weapons and ran in panic. Unit discipline fell apart completely. Men who had fought through years of brutal combat, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk and the long retreat across France, were reduced to terrified fugitives by a weapon they could not understand. By December 23rd, an estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds in the Ardennes alone. Prisoner of war interviews painted a consistent picture of terror and complete confusion. One German prisoner described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Multiple interviews recorded soldiers coming out of their shelters in a dazed state, unable to understand what they had experienced, or how they had survived when so many of their comrades had died. Their training had not prepared them for this. Their experience had not prepared them for this. Everything they knew about surviving artillery fire was suddenly useless.
In one recorded incident, American forces caught a German patrol in the Hopkins forest with a timed barrage using proximity fuses. A timed barrage coordinates multiple batteries to have all their shells arrive at the same instant, creating a single catastrophic explosion without warning. There is no advance fire to alert the targets, no opportunity to take cover. The 96 German bodies found afterward, according to an ordnance officer's report, looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. The psychological damage reached the point where German soldiers refused direct orders to leave their bunkers during artillery attacks. American intelligence reports described this as minor mutiny. Veterans of the Eastern Front and the Normandy hedgerows, hardened soldiers who had never before broken under fire, now cowered in their positions rather than face the unexplainable death that rained from above. When ordered to advance, they simply refused, preferring military punishment to certain death. German commanders desperately tried to understand what they were facing. They offered rewards to soldiers who could recover an intact fuse. They questioned prisoners, hoping to learn something about the mysterious weapon. Yet even when they overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses, German engineers failed to recognize what they had captured. The shells looked like ordinary artillery rounds.
the significance of the POSIT marking was not understood. This failure of recognition reveals something important about the proximity fuse's impact. Germany had spent years researching proximity fuses across more than 30 different designs. Their engineers had examined every possible approach, optical, acoustic, magnetic, and radio, and concluded that the concept was impossible for artillery shells. The acceleration forces were simply too extreme. No vacuum tube could survive being fired from a cannon. No battery could withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity. German science had determined that this particular technology could not be done. So when their own soldiers were being slaughtered by it, German technical experts literally could not comprehend what they were facing. It was as if their enemy had deployed a weapon that violated the laws of physics as the Germans understood them. They could not develop countermeasures for something they believed did not exist. This failure of imagination, rooted in the very thoroughness and rigor of German research, cost thousands of German soldiers their lives. The Battle of the Bulge raged until January 25, 1945. The German offensive, which had begun with such force and apparent promise, ultimately failed to achieve any of its objectives. The Meuse River was never crossed. Antwerp remained firmly in Allied hands. The hoped-for split between British and American forces never happened. Bastogne was relieved on December 26 when elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement. Instead of forcing a negotiated peace, the offensive used up Germany's last strategic reserves of men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. American casualties were severe, with approximately 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in the European theater. But German losses were catastrophic. Between 80,000 and 100,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. These were losses that Germany, in the final desperate months of the war, could never replace. The Eastern Front still demanded everything Germany could produce. The Battle of the Bulge, far from saving Germany, hastened its collapse. Approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells were used during the Battle of the Bulge. While it would be an oversimplification to credit the fuse alone for the Allied victory, its contribution was significant and widely recognized by those who witnessed its effects. General Patton wrote to the Chief of Army Ordnance with an assessment that would become famous. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," he wrote. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." He also stated flatly that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. James Finney Baxter III, the Pulitzer Prize-winning official historian of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, placed the proximity fuse among the 3 or 4 most extraordinary scientific achievements of the war. Alongside the atomic bomb and radar, the proximity fuse stands as one of the 3 most valuable technology developments of World War II. The comparison is instructive. The atomic bomb was used twice. Radar was primarily a detection and warning tool. The proximity fuse was fired more than 22 million times and directly multiplied the killing power of every gun that used against ground troops in the Ardennes. It increased artillery lethality 5-fold to 10-fold. December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The moment when Hitler's last offensive began. The moment when the secret weapon was finally turned loose against an enemy that could not comprehend what was killing them. It was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, a turning point in World War II, and a turning point in the history of warfare itself. The funny fuse had rained death from above, and nothing would ever be the same.